Throughout the Second World War, LCAs were used for landing Allied forces in almost every commando operation, major and minor, in the European theater. They also saw service in North Africa and the Indian Ocean. They saw a little service in the Pacific close to the end of the war. Below are operations involving LCA and LCA variants, and descriptions of how the attributes of the craft, good or ill, suited operational circumstances. 1940. The Norwegian Campaign. The first 4 LCAs used in an opposed landing disembarked 120 French Foreign Legionnaires of the 13th Demi Brigade, 13 EDBLE, on the beach at Bjørkvik, 8 miles, 13 km, north of Narvik, on 13 May during the Norwegian Campaign. 3757, the Army commander, General Anton Bathwad, responsible for capturing the area north of Rombax, realized that a landing behind German lines in the Herjungsfjord was required to force the enemy to retire. To assure that plans he made with the Royal Navy were understood by the Legionnaires, a meeting took place aboard HMS Effingham. The plan agreed involved the LCAs making the 20-mile, 32 km approach journey under their own power, a pre-landing bombardment by ships, followed by the landing of 3 tanks, 1 from a new LCM Mk. I and 2 from the older motor landing craft, MLC, then the landing of an initial wave of infantry from LCAs, and then a follow-on force carried in barges towed by motor torpedo boats. 5758. On 12 May, at about 23:40, Royal Navy destroyers commenced a bombardment of the town intended to destroy all buildings on the foreshore. The LCAs landed soon after 01:00 when the LCM Mk. I had delivered a tank to the beach. The other tanks in MLCs were delayed. 59. The LCA crews maneuvered their craft to the left of the village of Bjørkvik, the intended landing place, and under a slight rise in the ground in order to spare the soldiers' casualties from opposing machine gun fire. Though touchdown was in the early hours of the new day, the midnight sun illuminated the battle. Once ashore, the 13 EDBLE's companies deployed and moved to seize the high ground to the north and south of the town. This debut of the new LCA was seen, from a distance, by Admiral L.E.H. Maund, who had done much work in its development. We could see the dark forms, like so many ants, after their 5 hours in the LCA, run out of their craft, open out, and, without a moment's pause, advance across and over the knoll that covered the village from the west. They disappeared and later could be seen crossing behind the village on to the Grattingen Road to follow the first tank on its way to the north, and so take from the rear that was holding up the advance of the chasseur from Grattingen. 60. The LCAs, along with towed ship's boats and other landing craft types, then turned to landing the rest of 13 EDBLE and its supporting elements. Maund was most pleased with the efficiency with which the Legionnaires disembarked from the LCA. The small flotilla of LCAs, MLCs, and an LCM Mk. I had added greatly to the Allies' tactical latitude. 60 no LCAs were lost to enemy action during these operations in Norway. 1 craft was lost, sometime before 27 May, being burned out by accident while lying up on the east shore of the Herjungsfjord. 61. The 3 LCAs surviving could not be hoisted on available ships when the decision was made to evacuate. An attempt was made to tow them home behind trawlers, but the sea became too rough and the LCAs had to be cut adrift and sunk. 62. Dunkirk. More than a dozen LCAs were used in evacuating the BEF from Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo. 8 LCAs were sent to Dunkirk on a merchant ship, SS Clan Mac Allister. Designed to be hoisted on the standard passenger liner davits used for the 99-man lifeboats, the LCA could be carried and launched from a large number of merchant navy vessels. 63 Clan Mac Allister began hoisting out LCAs upon arriving off Dunkirk, 29 May, but was attacked and sunk before releasing half the craft. 62 5 LCAs were lost with Clan Mac Allister. The remaining 8 began taking soldiers off the beaches at La Panne and Dunkirk. One became stranded on the beach and was set afire by its crew, 62. The balance returned to England in a bad way after taking some 2,000 soldiers directly off the beaches, 64. 1941. Though the LCA had been designed around the most common likely load, a British infantry platoon, the original war establishment of a commando, a headquarters and 10 troops, was formed without reference to this fact. Early in 1941, each commando unit's establishment was changed to consist of a headquarters and 6 troops. Each troop would comprise 3 officers and 62 other ranks. This number was set so each troop would fit into 2 LCA, 65. Norway. 2 men each side of a wounded man, helping him towards a boat docked between houses. During archery, a wounded commando is brought to a LCA. In the steering shelter, the coxswain appears to be keeping the craft nosed onto the beach by keeping the engines gently ahead, while a seaman is preventing the craft from broaching to with a quant pole. In March, LCAs carried the first British commando raid of the war, directed at Norway. Operation Claymore was conducted by men of No. 3 and No. 4 commandos. The landing force were to destroy the fish oil-producing facilities in the ports of Stamsund, Hengstver, Svolvær, and Bredesnes. The 6 LCAs and 2 LCM. 1. S of the newly converted landing ship infantry, HMS Queen Emma, carried men of 4 commando, as well as Royal Engineer demolition experts, and a contingent of men from the Royal Norwegian Navy in a raid on the Lofoten Islands. HMS Princess Beatrix, also new and with a similar flotilla of landing craft, landed No. 3 Commando, 66. The 2 LSIs, in company with 5 destroyers, entered the Vestfjorden before 04:00 on 4 March and launched their attack. The morning weather was clear, cold, and calm, and the landing craft approached all 4 landing points more or less simultaneously in broad daylight. Sunrise was approximately 06:20. 67. The LCAs were crowded with raiders, one craft ferrying 41 officers and men in addition to the 4-man crew. 66. The occasional ice-cold wave would lop over the side to brace the passengers. Surprise was complete, and there was little resistance. Though the LCA crews had been told to expect gently shelving beach, the quay at the landing was quite high, and local civilians had gathered to tie up the landing craft and assist the troops in climbing the quay. 66. All targets selected were located and destroyed. The troops were embarked by 13:00, and within half an hour the British had left. After returning, the LCA flotilla from Queen Emma was used for a time in combined operations training in Scotland. 68. In December, there were 2 raids. The first was Operation Anklet, a raid on the Lofoten Islands by No. 12 Commando on 26 December. The German garrison was in the midst of their Christmas celebrations and was easily overcome. The commandos re-embarked after 2 days. Operation Archery was a larger raid at Vagsøy Island. This raid involved men from NOS 2, 3, 4, and 6 commandos, a Royal Navy flotilla, and limited air support. The raid caused significant damage to factories, warehouses, and the German garrison, and sank 8 ships. After this, the Germans increased the garrison in Norway by an extra 30,000 troops, upgraded coastal and inland defenses, and sent a number of capital ships to the area. 69. Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, LCAs from HMS Glengel carried No. 7 Commando, designated a battalion lay force, 6th Infantry Division at the time, in their raid on Bardia in April. 70. The objective was to silence a coastal defense battery atop 300 ft high cliffs on a rocky coast. Here the sturdy hull of the LCA, coupled with the skill of the crews, allowed many of the commandos to land almost dry-shod. 71. Later that month, following the successful German intervention, LCAs were involved in the evacuation of Greece, where in hastily organized operations some 50,000 troops were embarked from ports including Porto Rafti, Argos, and Kalamata. In May, LCAs ferried many of these troops to Crete, and days later, LCAs from Glengel and HMT Cameronia evacuated 6,000 Argol and Sutherland Highlanders during the evacuation of Crete. 1942. Operation Biting between 27–28 February, also known as the Brunneville Raid, targeted a German coastal radar installation atop 300-foot, 91 m cliffs. The raiding party itself was dropped by parachute at night, and following the raid was taken back to England by sea. The naval force under Commander F.N. Cook, Royal Australian Navy, departed earlier during the afternoon of the 27th for the journey across the Channel. Motor gun boats, MGBs, towed LCAs across the Channel. LCA crews manned their craft during such tows, and carried detachments from No. 12 Commando, who would provide fire support for the raiding party when they reached the evacuation beach. To accomplish this task, each LCA had sandbags laid down its decks as parapets for boys' anti-tank rifles and Bren guns fitted with high-volume drum magazines. 72. When close to the coast, the commandos climbed into the LCAs, the crews cast off, and the craft made for the beach under their own power. Meanwhile, on land, having accomplished their objectives, the airborne raiders withdrew through a gully in the cliffs to the evacuation beach. 73. By this time, it was 02:15 NB2. A sea mist prevented the naval force from seeing paratroopers' signals to evacuate them. 74. The raiders fired off an emergency very light seen by 3 LCA crews who soon approached accompanied by 3 MGBs. The original plan for the operation had called for 2 LCAs to land on the beach at a time, but this had never been satisfactorily achieved during the training maneuvers. Instead, as the other 3 LCAs caught up, all 6 landed at the same time. 1 LCA 125 dropped its kedge anchor just prior to beaching, but the anchor line played out and ran off the drum. 75 troops in the landing craft opened fire on German troops gathering by the top of the cliff. 76 with all the craft beached at once, and enemy fire causing considerable confusion on the beach. Some LCAs left overcrowded, whilst others left half empty. The coxswain of LCA 125 was able to reverse his engines quickly and prevent the craft from being stranded. The entire raiding force was taken off the beach and soon transferred to MGBs for more comfortable transport back to England. Communications had failed. The naval force had received no signals apart from the very light, and had spent much of the time hiding from a German naval patrol that had nearly discovered them. The journey back to Britain was uneventful, with the MGBs, LCAs in tow, being escorted by 4 destroyers and a flight of Spitfires. 76. This raid, with its dramatic embarkation from the base of a cliff occupied by enemy soldiers, demonstrated the need for deck armor on LCA. Production of new craft soon incorporated 1 4-inch armor for the decks over the hold and the stoker's position. In April, 2 troops of No. 4 Commando and 8 officers, and 43 other ranks of the Carleton and York Regiment, 1st Canadian Infantry Division, took part in Abercrombie, a raid on Hardelot, France, near Boulogne. The LCAs of HMS Prince Albert transported the party. This raid also marked the first operational use of the new LCS. 77. The raid set out on the night of 19 April with the LCAs towed by MGBs. The plan was for the party to travel to within 2 miles, 3.2 km of the French coast on the MGBs, and then transfer to the LCA for the landing. Due to high seas and strong winds, which swamped and sank LCA 211, the raid was stopped with the loss of 2 naval ratings. 77–78. The raid was remounted 2 nights later in calmer seas, but the period of optimum tide, moon, and darkness had passed. The raid became uncoordinated, and whilst the commandos got ashore and began their mission, the boats with the regular infantry became lost. Soon a German E-boat was engaged by the MGBs. The Army officers in the LCA conferred and decided not to disembark. Aboard the LCS, the senior naval officer's compass failed, and the flotilla only returned to England steered by Lt. Groom's Army Compass, 79. Madagascar. British soldiers landing at Tamatave 18 September 1942. The portside Lewis gun shelter of their LCA is visible at the bottom right. In response to the dramatic Japanese advances in early 1942, combined operations landing craft were shipped to the Indian Ocean for Operation Ironclad, the invasion of the Vichy French colony of Madagascar on 5 May. Following the assault, it was intended that the craft would be sent on to India and Burma. The initial target was the naval base at Diego Suarez. The harbor entrance faced east and was well defended with gun batteries, but a neck of land 3 to 6 miles, 4.8 to 9.7 km, wide separated Diego Suarez from good landing beaches, in Courier Bay and Ambarata Bay, on the northwest coast. The joint planners decided in favor of these western beaches as opposed to a direct approach. This decision had a definite effect on the employment of the LCAs. Despite the advantages of the western approach, the LCAs and other vessels would have to contend with rocks, reefs, and mines. 81. Diego Suarez. Ironclad was Britain's longest-range amphibious operation of the war. The landing ships were the LSI's HMS Winchester Castle with 14 LCAs, HMS Royal Ulsterman, Karen, and Karanya each carrying 6 LCAs, Sobieski with LCP, LS, RFA Durantdale carrying 15 LCM Mk, 1 S to land tanks and other vehicles, and HMS Bocaquero, the world's first operational LSD. Few could sleep between supper and midnight 4 May because of the turgid tropical heat and the noise from preparing the LCAs. 82-83. Across the boat decks of the LSIs, all sorts of stores were being manhandled into the LCAs. Because of the long journeys which the landing craft had to make from the parent ships to the landing beaches in Courier Bay and Ambarata Bay, the landing craft crews ate breakfast at midnight on 4-5 May. At 02:00, the convoy had reached the outer anchorage, and the minesweepers were clearing the 8 miles, 13 km lanes to the main anchorage. 84, the 5 blacked-out LSIs sailed towards the coast, proceeding slowly in line ahead. The assault troops gathered by platoon at their assigned gangways and clambered into the LCAs. Orders were given to lower all assault craft to within 6 feet, 1.8 m of the waterline. 85. The electric motors of ships davits accomplished this with soldiers and vehicles, in the case of LCMs, aboard. Each LSI could just see the faint outline of the nearest ship ahead, as the convoy furtively sailed forwards. Navigation marker lights appeared marking the swept channel. The night was silent save the low throb of ship's engines, the churning of water, and the explosion of 2 swept mines, one at 03:00 and the other at 03:15. 80. In good time, the ships hove to and anchored. Electric motor noise filled the air once more as the LCAs were lowered the remaining distance and met the sea with a loud splash. 82. Then the LCAs chugged away, fully loaded with soldiers and equipment, headed into the darkness. The searchlight of HMS Lightning guided the LSI Royal Ulsterman into Courier Bay, carrying No. 5 Commando to an assault preliminary to the main landing. 86 at 04:30, the Royal Ulsterman's LCA touched down at the base of a 50 feet 15 m cliff, which the commandos then proceeded to scale, achieving complete surprise over the 2 Vichy gun crews. 87. The landings in Courier Bay were designated Red North, Red Center, Red South. And in addition to No. 5 Commando, LCAs also landed a company of the East Lancashire Regiment. A small force of corvettes preceded the LCAs to their landing beaches in Ambarata Bay, sweeping mines clear and placing navigational lights to mark safe passage through the rocks, enabling the flotillas to land 29th Brigade without casualties. 85-87. The beaches here were designated blue for the South Lancashire Regiment, and the balance of the East Lancashires north of the bay, white for the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in the center, and green for the Royal Scots Fusiliers at the south end of the bay. Touchdown was 04:45, 1/4 hours before sunrise. 06:06 on 5/5/42. The landings were made in darkness, though with almost a half-moon in the sky. Also, the sea was very calm. Complete surprise was achieved, against light or no opposition, as the Vichy French believed navigating through the reefs and rocks efficiently in the dark was not likely. 83. After retracting, the LCAs began making return trips back and forth with reinforcements and equipment. When the sun rose, the landing craft crews in Courier Bay discovered that they were surrounded by jagged rocks that continued as far out to seaward as they could see. 85. Because the approaches were more heavily mined than anticipated, the ships of the invasion fleet were unable to use the main anchorage safely until it was properly swept. 88. As the day proceeded, ship-to-shore travel became more difficult as a southeasterly gale blew up and made heavy seas. 89. But by this time, no one thought to delay operations for better weather. Thus, LCAs were required to make long and frequent journeys from ship to shore, with supplies and reinforcements in worsening sea conditions. 90. Originally, the joint planners had limited ironclad to the capture of Diego Suarez, after which the LCAs and other amphibious assets would travel on to India. With the naval base now in British control, the Admiralty gave orders 16 May that further operations in Madagascar were to be abandoned. The ships and craft assembled for ironclad were assigned to other pressing duties. 91. However, South African Prime Minister Smuts insisted on further Madagascan ports being captured. 92. This, along with a Vichy decision to fight on, kept LCAs employed in Madagascar through the end of September. Majunga, Morondava, and Nasi Bay. On 10 September, LCAs landed the lead elements of the 29th Brigade at Majunga in northwestern Madagascar to relaunch offensive operations ahead of the rainy season. 92-93. Though 0 hour was supposed to be before dawn, some of the landing craft broke down. The landings took place later in the day without the cover of darkness. As machine guns began firing on the landing craft, the support vessels fired on the shore, providing cover to the assaulting troops, who suffered casualties as they stormed the quayside. 87. Along the beaches, the high tide at the time of the assault carried the landing craft very close to the main seafront road, and at least one LCA was beached and stranded until the next tide. 93. The follow-on units of the 22nd East African Brigade also landed in LCAs and LCMs. At the same time, in a violent thunderstorm, a troop of No. 5 Commando made a diversionary assault on a radio station and airfield at Morondava, more than 400 miles, 640 km, south of Majunga. The commandos were not transported in LCAs, but entered the port aboard the destroyer HMAS Napier. 89-94. During the Madagascar operations, it became obvious that the LCA design was not ideal for utility and supply purposes, and future expeditions were allotted more LCMs and LCVs. 95. LCAs were used in additional landings during the campaign before Madagascar surrendered in September. Deep. 60 LCAs were involved in Operation Jubilee at Deep in August and carried the assault infantry of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, a Commando Royal Marines, and No. 4 Commando. 8 LCS, MKIS were among the fire support craft. The plan for this large-scale raid was for the force to stay ashore for 2 tides and re-embark on the rising tide before dark. 96. The operation included landings on beaches designated west to east, orange, green, white, red, blue, and yellow, NB3. Until Deep, LCAs had only been used in small numbers. The part of the naval plan, outlined for Operation JN01, for the deep raid that involved LCAs and other minor landing craft was much more complicated than any previous combined operations plan. In all other sizable raids beforehand, coxswains had groped in the darkness and spent extra time while finding the correct landing beaches. Now a large number of flotillas of various landing craft types needed to coordinate their activities. 97. The endless working up practices and landing exercises carried out prior to the deep assault were not confined to training infantry. They were also designed to shake down the crews of the landing craft flotillas. 98. This was necessary because officers and ratings with LCA experience were not left idle after operations, but were reassigned to other pressing duties throughout the Navy. This massive raid required more trained crews and more flotilla coordination. The few experienced LCA hands available had to be supplemented by dozens of new crewmen collected by the RNVR. These had to learn how to approach a beach, ground on it, disembark troops, ease off the beach, and remain offshore within instant call, ready to come when necessary. 98. In the Jubilee Plan, the LCAs for 2nd Division were to touch down just before dawn. The lowering point for the landing ships was 10 miles, 16 km from the shore. Here, too, was an added complication, because naval planners wished to avoid the danger of flotillas colliding, becoming mixed together and confused. Therefore, 0 hour was to be half an hour later for the inner than the outer beaches. 99. At about 03:00 NB4, the LCAs were to be lowered from their landing ships. Once the LCAs were away, the ships would then sail back to England. The LCAs would make the 2-hour journey to the shore. On 19 August, nautical twilight was 04:31 and sunrise 05:50. The 4 outer landings would touch down at 04:50 and the 2 inner flotillas of LCAs would touch down half an hour later. 99. After disembarking their troops, the LCAs, along with other landing craft types, were to withdraw away from the coast a few miles to an area protected by a smoke screen designated as the boat pool. Here the landing craft would wait until ordered to re-embark the assault force at the end of the operation. The LCAs were to make their own way back. 100. Despite the plan, the raid soon began to go wrong. At 03:47, while approximately 7 miles from the French coast, the 1st and 24th Flotillas LCPL, some craft crewed by RCNVR, carrying No. 3 Commando, were illuminated by star shells fired from a group of German armed trawlers. 101. The element of surprise was lost. Orange Beach. At the lowering position, 10 miles, 16 km off the coast, at 03:00, aboard the LSI Prinz Albert, the boatswain's whistle summoned the troops of No. 4 Commando to the loading deck. 7 LCAs waited on their davits for the commandos, most of whom were overloaded with 3 mortar bombs and equipment, to walk across the gangways onto the sterns of the landing craft. 0 hour for landing was to be 04:50 and re-embarkation was timed for 07:31. 2 hours and 40 minutes for the commando operation. In darkness, the LCAs were then lowered into the channel. Prinz Albert's 8th LCA would be employed in transporting Goatley boats to the withdrawal at the close of the operation. Once the landing craft were away, Prinz Albert sailed back to England. The landing craft enjoyed a number of navigating advantages, mostly planned, but one great windfall was provided by the Germans. The flotilla formed 2 columns behind their navigational guide, MGB 312, and set off for the coast. Also escorting the flotilla was steam gunboat SGB 9, ready to provide close support. Both these gunboats possessed far more sophisticated navigational instruments than the LCA. The Point Daly lighthouse was working. Its silhouette stood out plainly against the horizon from sea level. Even when not lit, it could be seen for 5 miles 8 km on a clear night through binoculars. 103. For the LCA flotilla, tactical surprise seemed possible, as it was highly improbable that the enemy would be obliging enough to assist the Royal Navy with such a brilliant navigational aid. Looking over to the east at 0350, those aboard these LCAs could see the gunfire and flares that marked the collision of the Yellow Beach flotillas with the German Conv. 104. Once the fire of the engagement far off to port died away, navigation was aided again by the spectacle of red and green navigation lights shining steadily on Deep's harbor entrance. At about 0430, just before nautical twilight, the flotilla broke into two. One group of 3 LCAs continued on the same bearing toward vast arrival, Orange 1 Beach, and 4 LCAs followed MGB 312 to a new bearing starboard along the coast to Quiberville, Orange 2 Beach. Approximately 2 miles, 3.2 km, separated the Orange Beaches. 2 Spitfires flew overhead and fired on the lighthouse, which straightway doused its light. Anti-aircraft fire went aloft along the coast as additional planes strafed the Hess battery, creating a distraction which covered the approach of the landing craft. The first LCA group, arriving at 0450 at Orange 1 Beach, touched down with textbook precision at the right beach at the right time. The shingle beach was simply a narrow cove, perhaps 70 yards long with the beach 60 yards deep. The commandos raced up the beach unopposed, 105. The 4 LCAs approaching Quiberville were observed from shore and illuminated by star shell at 0453 104, just as they were making their final run in to touch down. Orange 2 Beach was larger, some 300 yards, 270 m, long and 400 yards, 370 m, deep, with an incline to the right leading to the wide valley of the River San. Incoming machine gun fire from pillboxes did not cause casualties while the commandos were aboard the armored landing craft. This unit was able to accomplish its mission, the destruction of the Hess battery. Main article, Number 4 Commando Section Deep Raid. Once the LCAs had landed the commando at Quiberville, they withdrew and made their way to vast arrival. The commando's withdrawal was made through Orange 1 Beach, the calculation being that the German reaction would concentrate on Quiberville. In this, the plan was most successful. The enemy made no attempt to counterattack, only desultory sniping. The reembarkation began at approximately 0730 under cover of 18-type smoke generators on the beach and naval smoke floats on the water. 106. The wide, flat beach and rapidly ebbing tide made reembarkation difficult, and the troops had to wade out up to their necks to reach the landing craft, which had waited unmolested 50 yards offshore throughout the operation. The commandos had to wade out to the LCAs because the fast-ebbing tide threatened to strand any craft that touched down. 107. Goatley collapsible boats were brought in by an LCA crew to help cover the water gap, widening by the fast-ebbing tide. 108. German prisoners were used to carry the wounded down to the water, where they were placed in the Goatley boats for the trip out to the LCA. By 0815, the LCAs had re-embarked the raiders. 2 miles offshore, the wounded were transferred to a destroyer on the way back to the boat pool around HMS Calp, and then the LCAs returned the approximately 65 miles, 105 km, to England under their own power. Blue Beach. The main landings, those by 2nd Canadian Division, were mostly crushed on the beaches. At Pye's Blue Beach, some of the LCAs transporting the Royal Regiment of Canada mistook for their guide boat another similar craft. Corrections in course were made, but this was at the cost of arriving a quarter of an hour late. 109. Touchdown at Pye's was about 0510 in the light of dawn and amid German flares, instead of 0450 darkness. 110. Some LCAs were able to provide the men first off a dry landing, but those last off the landing craft had to jump into the water and wade ashore. 111. In certain beaching conditions, each man's last step as he ran off the ramp pushed the LCA back out to sea. Alastair Ferguson, second in command of the 7 LCAs of the 10th LCA flotilla, carried on HMS Princess Astrid, felt his LCA scrape bottom as enemy fire poured down from a cliff, entering the craft. Having touched down, he ordered down ramp and urged the troops of the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Royal Canadian Artillery onto the beach. 112 soldiers were shot down before they cleared the ramp, where their bodies blocked others. Others fell as they crossed the beach to the seawall 40 feet, 12 m, away. The operation was not successful. All 3 waves, 1st and 2nd LCA and 3rd LCM-1, on Blue Beach were subject to withering fire. The Royal Regiment were trapped against the impenetrable seawall.